Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Founders Table. This podcast is focused on conversations with current founders to deconstruct their lessons and tactics in order to help you build your own startup. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and subscribe in your podcast app. This will keep you up to date on latest episodes, as well as help others find out about the show. Today, my guest is Martin Mao, founder of Chronosphere, a modern observability platform focused on cloud-native architectures and fine-grained control of observability data. Mao tried his hand at founding various startups during his college years, including an Australian Facebook competitor, before joining big tech and working at companies like Microsoft, AWS, and Uber. At Uber, Mao is the manager of its in-house observability team, which developed M3, an open-source Prometheus-compatible metrics backend. This is the same backend that powers Chronosphere. In today's episode, we talk about skipping the seed stage and directly raising a Series A with an 80-page business plan, the challenges of cloud-native architectures, and understanding actual market needs versus theoretical projections. And now, without any further ado, I give you Martin Mao.
Welcome to Founders Table. I'm excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Looking forward to our conversation.
Before we talk about the business, I think I read on your profile that you love meat pies. And I'm curious if you have a favorite and what do you look for in a meat pie?
Yeah, in particular, Australian meat pies, which are a little bit different from the British ones there. As the name implies, meat is the main ingredient. I would say my favorite is probably steak and mushroom. It's probably my favorite combination of meat pies. I live out in Seattle. There's actually a Australian bakery. You can get them here in Seattle for those interested.
What's hilarious is over the weekend I was at an event that they were serving vegetarian meat pies that was just spinach. I wonder what your reaction to that is.
Each to their own. I think there's a lot of different ingredients you can use for pies for sure. Personally, the meat is a key ingredient for me personally. But I would say, yeah, there's definitely many different combinations of pies you can go out there.
To each their own. Then bringing this back to startups, as I understand it, you have kind of gone and started a few companies ahead of Chronosphere back when you were in Australia. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your early startup days and what got you into it?
Yeah, for sure. I'll precursor this with I bootstrapped some unsuccessful startups in Australia. But I'd say what probably got me into it is, I was in college still, young, liked to just, build a bunch of random apps or programs here or there. That probably was what sparked a lot of those early startups, was just mucking around with things on the side and seeing if we can turn it into a business. And back then I don't think, I was thinking about like TAM or go-to-market strategy or anything. It was like, hey, friends of mine need a text messaging app to organize sports on the weekend. So like, let's go build one of those and see if we can start selling it. So it was that type of experience more than anything else. The one more serious one I was part of actually, I was working with this company and we were trying to create a social media for Australia. This is like back in 07, 08, where Facebook hadn't quite reached Australia yet. And we were trying to mimic that idea while also combining it with Yelp as well. So like a social network with like restaurant review type of thing. It's almost like taking the ideas that are working here in the US and trying to pioneer them and localize them for Australia. That was probably the more serious startup attempt. And I think, we had a decent product, and then of course Facebook and Yelp and those came into the country and completely dominated us. But yeah.
Looking back at that, do you think there's anything you could have done to have had a different outcome?
I think for the majority of them, again, I think the goal was not to create a big company or anything like that. I think the goal was like, this is fun and let's see where it goes. I think it's pretty different from looking at starting a business where, you have outside investors, because I think you need to take it at a certain level of seriousness there and have some, financial goals there. So I think that is one difference there. I think, on the startup, I think it was interesting because when we thought about the problem, you can imagine a social network. One of the hardest components is to build. It's like a supply and demand problem. You got to build enough interest into the social network for it to sort of go viral. And clearly, Facebook had done that well through the colleges here in the US. One of the mistakes we probably made on that one is we tried to shortcut that using an existing social network. So Kevin, I don't know if you did this back in the day, but everybody was using MSN Messenger back in the day, right?
I remember that.
At least out in Australia. And we were like, hey, that's tied to your Hotmail account. And actually, Microsoft have APIs around that you could sort of, do single sign-on through your Hotmail account, and all of your contacts in Messenger would already be there. So we sort of decided to go down that route and leverage that as almost like a bootstrap to the social network. So when you log in, you have your network of folks on Messenger. And I think we thought it was a smart way to bootstrap that network. But I think looking back now, what that ended up doing, and I think one of the main differences is, on Facebook, it's your real profile, it's your real name, it's your real friends, it's your real photos. Whereas in Messenger, everybody was anonymous. So while I had these contacts, everybody had their screen names, and these weren't perhaps people that you had met in real life. So I think the source of that and the use of that list was different. And I think translating that didn't work as nicely as, what Facebook ended up doing, which was real world profiles, right? So looking back, that was probably a mistake, but I think it was a bet that we had to take to try to bootstrap the social network, because I think that is probably one of the hardest pieces of those there. Now, would we have won if we had done it the other way? I don't know. I don't know about that. I would just say that I think the advantage we had is, again, we were trying to move fast as a startup. We created like particular features ahead of maybe some of the products here, like around, hosting events. You can imagine trying to marry a Facebook and a Yelp, like you can host events at real restaurants, right? And we can combine those things and things like that. So it was an interesting feature set, at least. But yeah, again, as soon as Facebook and Yelp started in Australia, it just, we quickly disappeared, I would say. But yeah.
I really like your point about looking back at shortcutting the network bootstrapping by leveraging MSN, and how that might be like a double-sided kind of advantage. Because I find that I think that's a dynamic that plays out across a lot of companies, especially startups, is you have this option of, can you leverage what already exists by either building yourself as an integration or plugin, or leveraging some prior source and getting a head start, versus building something completely from scratch, needing to do all the work, but then being able to essentially earn the benefit of something that is built natively for what you want to do.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I think definitely when it comes to technology choices in particular, and for us, it was trying to bootstrap a network. And then, again, looking back at that experience, we didn't have like a business development team or anything like that to really look at, I think as a business strategically, what were the requirements there. I think we were a bunch of tech-focused people thinking about how we can quickly bootstrap this without the business side of things. But yeah, I think a lot of startups come across that type of decision. In particular, I would say on the technology stack, right? And I think it's one of these things where, do you need to have the ideal technology stack perfectly designed before you get to product market fit, or can you go and try to take a shortcut there and come in and rebuild some of that stuff later on? I think that's a common probably decision that that a lot of early stage startups have to make.
I absolutely agree. And now jumping forward to your current company, Chronosphere, I guess first, for folks that might not be familiar, how would you describe yourselves?
Yeah, we're an observability platform. I know that word is used a lot these days, but for us, observability platform, you can imagine you can use it to observe or monitor your infrastructure, both physical and virtual or containerized. You can use it to observe your applications, and perhaps the business flows that run on top of that as well would include things like log management, distributed tracing or APM or infrastructure monitoring there as well. So we're an observability platform, and in particular, we target and we optimize ourselves for cloud native architecture and cloud native deployments, right? So if you're adopting microservices on containers, especially at scale, I would say you have a special set of pains and challenges that you would face versus if you went more of a monolithic VM-based architecture. And we've tailored our observability platform for that type of environment there.
Earlier, you mentioned how when you first did your round of startups, you didn't necessarily have a business plan. And I find that uh, great in contrast with Chronosphere, because as I understand it, when you first launched, you had somewhat of an 80-page business plan
Yes.
for raising. And I'm curious about that approach, because nowadays, especially in Silicon Valley, Laura, you hear a lot of startups being started on the backs of napkins. And I think the opposite of that approach is having this very detailed business plan. What made you decide to go down the business plan heavy route, and how well has that served you?
Yeah, great question. We did. You're right. This time we tried this with a 80-page business plan, perhaps a little overkill there. I think for me, at least, it was a few different things. It was definitely partially learning from my previous experiences, where I think just kicking some technology around did not work out well. So trying to think about the actual business we were trying to build, the market we were trying to be in, the competitors, and I think trying to take a deeper look at that. I think this time we were definitely trying to get outside, Silicon Valley VC investment. So I think there's a next level of seriousness you have to think about on the business versus a bootstrap type of business. So that was different about it this time. And also the situation that both myself and my co-founder were pretty different. When I did my early startups, college student, didn't have a lot of pressures, and alternative options were slim, being in tech in Australia, especially when you're young. And I think, in between then, so, between when I did those early startups and when we started Chronosphere, probably 10, 15 years where I spent at big tech companies, right, building up a career there. So I think there was also a much higher opportunity cost to ditch the traditional path of my career and go into a startup. And honestly, the business plan was, for myself and my co-founder, we wanted to do that, to even convince ourselves that there was a real business to be built here. Because if there wasn't, spending a couple of years, trying to build something where we both have young families now and different sort of financial pressures on us, I think is just a different point in life and a different decision to make there. So I think all of those factored into it. I also think in our business, it was a little unique in the sense that, we're not tackling necessarily a brand new problem. Like the concept of observability or monitoring has been around for a very long time. And what was also unique was that we had built this technology internally at Uber. So, you can imagine for us, it was less about the technology challenges because we had some experience building the technology already. So it was less about the technical parts of the problem. It was way more about convincing ourselves that there is a business and an opportunity in the market, and a very crowded market at that, to even tackle. So I think all of those conditions went into why I think it was a good decision for us at the time. What was interesting is that once we put that together to convince ourselves it was a good idea, we actually just sent that across to the VC investors, and they also were pleasantly surprised by that. Because to your point, generally people go raise these days with a very slim pitch deck or something drawn up on a napkin, as opposed to a well thought out business plan. And I think that sort of surprised the VCs a little bit. And it was just a different approach for sure. And I don't know if it ultimately helped us. I assume it did because we got funding. But I think it also then, we were able to leverage that into fundraising pretty quickly as well.
And I understand that when you fundraised, you skip the seed stage and straight to A. Um, and I'm curious what the rationale was.
Yeah, nothing strategic behind it. Honestly, the plan was to, and again, it's because we had all the technology ready to go. The plan was to build a SaaS product on top. So we sort of knew what the product we wanted to build was. I needed a team, a sizable team to go do that. So like the idea behind this is we just needed to raise back in the day, a large sum of money for an early stage company. We wanted to raise $11 million to go fund the building of this SaaS product. And we just got told, this is back in 2019, the world is definitely different now, but back then we were just told, hey, that's just too large of a check to be called a seed. So we're going to call it a Series A. And I was like, okay, it doesn't matter to me. We can call it a seed, a Series A. What mattered to me and my co-founder was like, hey, we need this amount of money and we're going to go hire this team and we're going to build this product. And you can call it whatever you want. Like it didn't necessarily matter to us. So nothing strategic there. I don't think we were far ahead of a seed stage or anything like that. I think we knew that the space we're in, we knew that the product we wanted to build, but there was no product market fit or anything like that. So it was still sort of starting out. It was just the two of us with an 80-page plan, and that was it at the beginning. And calling it a Series A versus a seed was purely about the sum of money that we wanted to raise at the time. I don't know if that's an issue these days. I don't think so. I've seen some pretty large seed checks these days, but 2019 was still, I wouldn't say an early time, but it was a different fundraising environment than it is today. But yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, nowadays with seeds, especially for AI companies, I think people tap out a few extra zeros at the end there.
Exactly. So, it made no difference in the way we were executing or anything like that. But yeah.
And then in terms of that 80-page business plan, how much of it did you find stayed relevant within, let's say, like the first year and then like the first 2 years?
I would say probably within the first 3 to 6 months, especially as we started to talk to prospects and customers and actually engage in the market, because this is all, you got to remember, Kevin, this is all theoretical before we started. Went out the window. So, the type of business we thought we were going to build and we had, and I actually went back and looked at this just to reminisce at a certain point, how we had modeled the business in terms of the types of products we were going to sell, the segments we're going to go after, the size of the deals. Everything was just completely wrong. So I would say pretty quickly, I think, the execution part of the plan, or our forecast of how we would execute, went out the window, and we executed in a different way. The part that was the same, and I think still remains largely the same today, was we spent I don't know about a decent portion, but we probably spent about 30-40% of that business plan on the current market and the research there, the competitive space, where the strengths and weaknesses were, where the opportunity to attack the market was. And for us, it was this sort of shift of companies to adopt cloud native architecture, like especially in the enterprise. And I actually think, and we could talk about this in a second, I actually think for different reasons than why tech companies like Uber do. But like all of that remained consistent and still remains consistent today. So I think part of that plan, especially the understanding of the market and how we would approach it, remained consistent. The actual forecasting of how we would go about executing on that went out the window within the first 6 months, right? The good thing for us is how we actually executed was far better than what we had forecasted, which was lucky and nice for us. But that definitely changed instantaneously, and I think that's just the difference of like, in theory, at home in a room, how you think the real world would react versus how you actually go talk to customers is quite different. But yeah.
And I would love to dive into that. So, how did you model the execution originally, and what did you end up doing?
Yeah. So, just to give a little bit more context here, we had built a lot of the, I wouldn't say at Uber we built an observability product. What we built was a lot of good storage infrastructure for observability. We built a time series database, for example. That was a great data store for metric-based data. And not only did we build that at Uber, we had actually open sourced it as well. And we open sourced it originally just because this is back in like 2016. We never thought about building a business. It was always us realizing that generally big tech companies at a certain point, especially if they are going containerized cloud native environments, need something like this. And a lot of the big companies out there like Google built something like this in-house, or Facebook, but they don't open source it. They write a white paper about how they do it, but they don't really open source the tech. So for us, we had built it internally, and we had open sourced it originally with the intention of, look, the next big tech company that comes along can just use our open source tech. There's no need to rebuild the same thing again and again. So one of the things we had when we started the company was we had this open source project that was a good storage tier for an observability platform. And you can imagine 2019 was when companies like Confluent were going public and whatnot. It was, or Mongo had blazed that path, and Elastic. So there was a thought that hey, perhaps we could start with a more open source, open core business model where we could monetize that open source community with like an enterprise version, or like support and services, and then eventually turn that into a SaaS multi-tenanted observability product. That was the original plan. And what we found pretty quickly, talking to real customers, and we had interviewed some folks when we were writing the business plan, but I think it's different when you're interviewing somebody theoretically versus actually talking to them about a real decision that company has to make. And I think it was pretty clear early on that look, they didn't want a time series database. They really wanted an observability product. So it was pretty clear that the demand in the market was really in a SaaS observability product that we would have to build on top of this storage tech. And actually, rather than having a lot of tiny multi-tenanted customers, big tech companies out there wanted this and a nice product in SaaS. So that would be one of the big differences in how we thought the business would unfold versus what actually happened. And you can imagine we figured that out within 6 months and just started to build that SaaS product for really large tech companies originally, and just started selling that. And we just never ended up building a enterprise version business, or like a support business, or any of those pieces that you would if you look at how Mongo and Confluent got started, and perhaps Elastic as well, that was the path that they had gone down, and we thought that perhaps something similar was a more viable path. But what we ended up realizing once we actually got to market was no, and that's why we ended up with our current product, which is a SaaS observability platform.
Do you still remember your first customer and what it took to onboard them?
I do. I both remember the first customer and onboarding. I also remember the first pilots that we ran, which were probably even tougher than the first customer there. And it took a lot. It took a lot to onboard them because. And we were lucky that we had, again, technology that was proven from Uber, but it's different from selling somebody a SaaS product, right? When you build something internally in a tech company, the sort of expectations, the SLAs, the interactions from, an internal team using your technology versus an actual customer are fairly wildly different. And there were definitely, I would say, some long nights spent scrambling to ensure that our SaaS product would, still be up and running in the early days when people threw real production load at it. But yeah.
And since the very beginning, was it that you went after enterprise customers? Was that the case?
Yeah, we think about the world a little bit differently. So if you think about enterprise as just companies with more than X employees, yes, we did do that, and that's what ended up happening. But our plan wasn't necessarily that. It was the technology we had built at Uber was to support Uber's transition and adoption of cloud native architecture, right? So what we were looking for were large cloud native deployments. wherever those were, that was the best use case for us, regardless of whether you're a Fortune 500 or a smaller tech startup. Like whoever had the largest Kubernetes clusters, like that's where our value was the highest. On top of that, I think what we walked away from with Uber was properties of a technology that suited larger environments and larger companies, right? You can imagine at Uber, we had to build this thing with a high level of reliability. So this thing could run between 4 to 5 nines reliability. Well, if you're a little startup or you're a mom and pop shop, you probably don't care that your SaaS solution has 4 to 5 nines of reliability, right? We had to solve the cost problem. As we all know, observability in cloud native environments in particular get really expensive just because of how much data is being produced. So we had to have something that solved the cost problem there. And again, you only care about that if you're at scale. We had something that could ingest like 2 billion data point writes per second, but you only cared about that if you had a sizable workload. So all of the properties of the technology that we had open sourced was already well suited for large cloud native deployments. And we knew we would have the biggest advantage against the other products in the market in that segment. So therefore, we went after that. So it was less that it was enterprise. It was more, where do those exist? And it just so happened that back in 2019, the largest cloud native deployments were at big tech companies, right? They were the most tech forward, in terms of their architecture. They actually had production workloads running on either Mesos or Kubernetes, and like that was where we targeted. And I think over time, that has since then evolved into what we may call enterprises now, the Fortune 500s and whatnot. But back then, I would say it was pretty limited to the tech companies of the world. So we always targeted and went for companies based on that, because that's just where we have the biggest competitive advantage. That's what we built the technology for. And I really think, if you're a 3-person startup, you don't need the power of what we do. It doesn't make sense for you to buy, this type of product. So we were pretty clear about that at the beginning. But yeah.
There were a few things that you talked about that I would love to dive into more, which is this idea of cloud native deployments, or companies that have adopted cloud native deployments, as well as this problem of observability costs at scale in these environments, and maybe set the frame for folks of the challenges of observability in cloud native environments. Why was this a change from what came before, and why is cost such a chief concern here?
Yeah, for sure. We'd love to cover that. I think I might even take a step back from that, right? Like if you think about cloud native, I think the Ubers and the Googles of the world, I think they realize that this way of architecting and operating allowed individual teams to run faster and allowed them to have a product that was more, and a service that was more responsive to their customers, right? So I think there was an original want for that, and that was the reason why we created this type of architecture. I think for enterprises these days, it's a little different. I think some of them definitely want those benefits. I think for a lot of enterprises, if you're an enterprise, you probably need a hybrid or multi-cloud strategy, right? Like it's probably not prudent for you to pick one public cloud provider and bet all your eggs there, right? So if you think about that, what's interesting is, Kubernetes is the only common platform that all the major cloud providers and VMware and Red Hat IBM support commonly amongst them, right? So I think that's part of the reason why there is a lot of adoption there. And if you think about moving a workload from, like, just put observability aside for a second, if you just think about moving a monolithic application workload on a VM into a microservices containerized workload on Kubernetes, actually the cost of that move from a cloud provider perspective, like your AWS bill, doesn't grow that much, right? Because you're still underlyingly paying for the hardware, the compute, the memory, the storage. So it's a different architecture you're running, but it doesn't cost you more. Like they don't charge you an arm and a leg just to run Kubernetes on top, right? So the cost of cloud footprint remains relatively the same. Based on that cloud footprint and the resources you have, the number of requests or customers you can serve remains relatively the same as well, right? So you can imagine for an enterprise or a company, that shift doesn't really change the cost model elsewhere. You roughly still pay the same amount to your cloud providers, or for your hardware, and you roughly serve the same workload generally, right? So they're like, okay, like I can do that, and I get the benefits of cloud native and all that it promises. But I think one of the unintended consequences, and one of what we don't think about, one of them is observability, and I think one of the pains is cost, and the other pain is the types of problems are very different. And I'll explain that in a second. On the cost one, if you just think about it technically, observability is like, we just need visibility into infrastructure and the application, right? So if you think about infrastructure, now on top of my VM, my Kubernetes node, I run 20 containers. For each container, I need to know its CPU, its memory, its disk usage and whatnot, right? So if you just think about it, the infrastructure layer, there's just so much more measurements you need to make of smaller and smaller pieces of infrastructure, right? So that explodes one factor of it. If you think about the monolithic application down to microservices, same thing. That monolithic application could have handled 100,000 requests, but there's one, from an observability perspective, I need to monitor that one endpoint and know that there's 100,000 requests and know what the P99 is, or like the latency of that endpoint is. In the microservices architecture, there's 20 smaller instances of that application, probably serving 500 requests each or 5,000 requests each, or whatnot. But I now need to measure each one of those. So like the unintended consequences, even though you're serving the same amount of workload and it costs you the same on an infrastructure level, because the architecture is smaller and broken up into tiny pieces, the amount of observability data that gets produced increments in a step size. And that directly, we all have to store this data, so that just directly impacts every observability solution's bottom line, and hence these things get a lot more expensive, right? That's one, and that to me is a somewhat like a physics problem there. Although we have an interesting way to solve that problem, but it's not that the vendors are getting greedy. They have to store 10x the amount of data, and it's just going to cost them more to store that data, and hence they're going to pass some of those costs onto you. So one of the problems is cost problem. The other problem, I think, is, in my mind at least, the types of problems that the types of problems that occur in a cloud native environment, I think, are different to the types of problems that used to occur. It used to be called application performance monitoring, because often you're trying to see how your application interacts with the operating system and the hardware, and you're often looking for performance bottlenecks, as opposed to correctness bottlenecks, because you can imagine in the old way we write software, everything was very well tested before we ship that thing, because once you ship it out there, it's there for months or years at a time, right? So I think a lot of these sources of issues were performance-based issues with interaction of software and the operating system or the hardware underneath. Now, if you think about a modern architecture, the operating system, the hardware is abstracted away, so you don't even get that interface there at all. And a lot more of the sources of problems are interdependency caused between two smaller applications there, especially if each one is being deployed multiple times a day. You don't really know perhaps what the upstream downstream effects of those things are. So I think the types of problems that get introduced are very different, and hence I think you need a different type of product. Even though you're trying to achieve the same outcomes, I want reliability, I want low MTTR times, that the actual tool and the product needs to solve fundamentally a different type of problem, because the type of problem is different. So I think those are the two reasons why I think in cloud native you need a completely different approach and a different type of solution to really an age-old problem, right? Like we've needed monitoring or observability or whatever you want to call it. We've needed that concept ever since software and hardware has existed, but I think there's a new flavor of it, and there are new pain points and challenges. And that's what we really learned at Uber. And hence that's why we thought there was a market for something like this as the industry adopted cloud native.
I think I've definitely talked to other founders in the observability space who plot this kind of linear adoption of revenue, or just amount of metrics being submitted to the adoption of Kubernetes itself. I think I've heard this quote that a Kubernetes cluster that does nothing will still publish like 500,000 metric points.
Yep.
and it's just a totally different ballgame.
Yep.
So definitely with you on, the cost structure of cloud native
Mm,
is an order of magnitude more than kind of what came before it, and that
mm,
requires different tooling. Um, and I'm curious about the second point you mentioned, like different types of problems. Because
mm.
yes, so now you have lots of microservices versus maybe trying to figure out what the software hardware bottleneck is.
Yep.
How does that actually look on the tooling
Yeah.
side? Is it that you now have more traces versus logs, or like how kind of is like the interface or that UX different in
Yeah.
today's world versus the past?
Yeah. I even before we talk about the interface, I think even the end user of these tools are different. Now in perhaps big tech companies, the developer has always been on core for their application, but often you got to remember at most enterprises, they had dedicated operations teams, right? That were running stuff. So as a software developer, you write something, you ship it out. Like I did this at Microsoft. I wasn't technically on call for my product. It's gone out the door. Some other team is responsible for the operations, right? So I think even the end user you got to keep in mind often is very different. It is now the developer who wrote that piece of software that shipped it earlier that day. That person is responsible for the operation of that. And I think it has to be that way because there's no way a single person could understand the intricacies of this complicated cloud native architecture. I think the developer themselves are the end users. So I think that's already pretty different. I think that for most application developers, I don't know if they understand the full dependency tree themselves. Like I think they know maybe one level down, one level up, because that's the clearly, when you make an API request call to something else, that one level down. I don't think most developers know beyond that what other dependencies there are, right? Both on infrastructure and hardware. So I think, you're dealing with a end user of these solutions that own a smaller part of your architecture and don't even understand the full breadth of their dependency chain, both up and downstream. So you can imagine even giving them that information in production. And that's something that's constantly changing, right? It's not like we write the architecture once and it's like tomorrow, who knows, something three, 4 hops away, they change something there. So I think, these tools need to give the end user and the developer that visibility, ideally, because that's even a step one that I think, again, if you went to most application developers, I think in a microservices oriented architecture and ask them what the full dependency chain was, I don't think they'd be able to tell you that. And then I think in what we do here at Chronosphere is we try to say, okay, well, what would the human go do to debug the problem? If I was a developer, I'd probably come in if I'm being alerted on something and say, okay, let me go and look for my relevant infrastructure data to see if infrastructure issues are causing my problem. I'd probably go figure out who all my dependencies are and look at all of those dependencies and see if they are the cause of my problem. So that's the way we think how you would solve these problems manually as a developer. And then what we're trying to do in the product is, cool, could we automate a lot of that? And you can imagine if we know on the back end, based on your observability data, all of your dependencies. We actually have all the infrastructure data. So like, could we get the system and I'll tell you now, we can, to go and do that analysis for you, right? And start telling you things like, hey, we've already looked at, here's your relevant infrastructure data. This is what we see there. Here are your downstream dependencies. Here are those that are also perhaps, spiking in latency or whatnot. Those are the type of things I think that the end user wants to get out of the system. And those are things that the system is much better at just automatically analyzing and giving you that information. And I think often that becomes, the source of problems. Like I think in my personal experience, at least at Uber, the number one cause generally was either a piece of infrastructure broke somewhere and that's causing some issue, although, perhaps you can architect around those. Or more commonly, somebody downstream somewhere deployed something and now it's broken. And you don't even know what it is and how to fix it. But I think your main job is to find out who that was and get them to roll back, right? Like I think that's generally the number one source of issues that at least I experience. So, could the system go help you identify that quickly? I think that is the thing that we are trying to strive for here at Chronosphere, at least. But yeah.
Whenever nowadays I hear, hey, this is what a human would do, and we have all this
Mm.
rich data in which they would look at. It makes me think of AI.
Yeah.
And I
Mm.
am curious what your thoughts are on AI and observability, and
Yeah.
how you think of leveraging it, or if you do, inside of
Yeah.
Chronosphere.
We've been looking at this with some interest recently, actually. Um, you're right for sure. If you think about what the human can do, um, can a machine automate it? I think there's two nuances there that make it harder than it theoretically seems. The first one is, and I think this is a problem with AI in general, is the models are only as good as the data that it runs on, and often in observability the data is not clean. It's highly unstructured, it's not normalized, it's not scrubbed. Like the raw data, it's very hard to make automatic meaning out of. So a lot of what we do on the back end is normalize that data, right? Raw data is actually really hard to even manually traverse, let alone automatically traverse. So we actually spend a lot of time, normalizing things like, hey, this label here on this set of data actually is the same as that label over there, even though they have a different label identifier. Over here, we use camel case. Over there, we use dot separated. Basic things like that, you can imagine, prevent us from really understanding how the data is connected, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to clean up the underlying raw observability data to even, potentially start applying these things. And we also do, like, we started doing that before, the latest Gen AI trends, because, for us to build, for us to know what the dependencies are, even on top of this data, you can imagine we need that data to be normalized and clean so that we can sort of, extrapolate higher level meaning from this data as well. So I think that's one thing that's a nuance there. I think just applying these models on the raw data isn't effective because of that. And then the second thing I think is that as much as we try, we don't encapsulate everything about these systems in observability data. There's a lot of it there, but not everything is there. There's always that, I still think there's always that human concept of knowing something about the system or the infrastructure, or that there's an additional piece of knowledge that you need to figure out what the issue is. And that piece of knowledge is just not encoded in the observability data, because generally when you produce this data, you can't imagine every property, or it's not viable to put every different dimension and property on the data itself, perhaps, right? So I think that's also where the human, I think, has to be in the loop, because I just don't think the observability data even contains all of the information you need to root cause. Now, our approach is, okay, could we at least make it as easy as possible to have almost like human assisted, right? It's like instead of full self-driving, it's like human assisted driving or something like that. I think that has been found to be more effective in production today. I think eventually, maybe if like the you could guarantee that every property that you needed was encapsulated in the data, I think we could get a lot closer. But that's not something that you can imagine OpenTelemetry is helping us solve today, right? OpenTelemetry is just a protocol. So I think we're very far away from that world, and we still depend on humans to think about and generate the type of data to describe the systems. And I think that is today still flawed in the sense that it's only a partial representation of the system in the observability data. So, and that's as much as the tool can help with there. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I basically agree with uh, everything you said. I think starting just with the data, you need good data in order to get good results. And
Yeah.
I think observability data is usually the very last thing people think about standardizing
That's
until it
never clean. Let's
becomes,
put it that way. That's never clean, right?
yeah,
Because each team, and I think the reason is like each team goes and emits data localized to themselves, right? So like and when you do that, it's very hard to have consistency across that. And what we have found on that approach is you sort of need to do it after the fact. You need to let people just emit whatever they want to emit, and then it's much easier after the fact to sort of scrub and bridge and connect these things on the server side, as opposed to get people to do the right thing on the client side, because it's too easy for somebody to accidentally not do that, right? But yeah.
Looking forward, so Konosphere has grown a lot, I think, since you were founded in what, back in 2019, 2000.
2019. It's been about 5.5 years so far. Yeah.
Yeah, so I believe you raised a few rounds of funding.
Yeah.
You've now grown to a few hundred people. Uh, you have expanded your offering. You've partnered with CrowdStrike. You also have logging. You
Yeah.
recently acquired Colotia. You have an observability pipeline, and you're making all sorts of improvements to the products. Looking forward, I guess, in this year and the next, what are kind of the big priorities or milestones that you're hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, great question. As you rightly pointed out, we spent, probably the large part of the last year or two getting to the breadth of functionality that we need to be called an observability platform there, and I think we're pretty much there on the breadth. I would say our focus is now probably fall on two different sides, and it's interesting because the two sides are really the two problems we see in the industry, which is one, cost, as we talked about, and two, can these products be more effective for the cloud and native environment, right? So on the cost side, and we didn't get into this too much, but we've had this feature for a while called the control plane, where we're using the understanding of how you use that data and reapplying that understanding and the patterns on how you use it to go and optimize the incoming data stream to make it cheaper, because we can just store less data to give you the same outcomes. So the roadmap there is really to continue, and that's functionality we have today. The roadmap there is to more and more ideally sort of automate that even more than it is today. So all the tools are there, but again, like our end customers, the human has to be in the loop to make some of those decisions. We show them all the analysis and all of that. I think, you can imagine a world where ideally an end user doesn't need to care about it. Like as an end user, I just want to make some query. I want to make sure the data is there. And if you could save me a ton of cost ensuring that query works, great, right? So I think that's the end goal for us on that side. And, where we have all of the ingredients, but, I think there's still a little bit more to do to have the end users not have to think about it as much. And then on our developer experience side, we call our product Chronosphere Lens there. And really that's going down further and further down that path of like how much automated analysis could we do for you. So we just we've been exploring that. You can imagine there are different ways to analyze that data. You can do it based on now versus an hour ago, like temporal in a particular way. You can do it like all of the different dimensions that are on that data. There are a number of different ways to analyze the data to come up with some, I wouldn't say root causes, but I would say hypothesis probably is the best way to describe it. And we are doing more and more on that realm to sort of help generate these hypotheses for each individual end user who comes in, because you can imagine each person cares about a different part of the stack, and that's really where that developer experience is going. And I think that experience is so much more than and fairly different from the traditional, okay, I'm a list of dashboards, I'm a list of alerts. When something goes wrong, I'm going to go find the right dashboard and then go figure things out. Like you can imagine the system can hypothesize the issues and show you its analysis that shortcuts a lot of that. So that's generally the high level themes. You can imagine there's a lot of specific features that serve that, but the high level themes are really about that. And then the end user developer experience also is, I think we're in a world where every endpoint has an SLO these days, and yes, SLO is important, but like there's also this concept of like what really matters when I get paged at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? Is it does this really matter for the business right now, or like can this wait until the morning? I think that problem is exacerbated in the cloud native environment just because there's so many things that could go wrong and there's so much noise. And also you also, one of the reasons companies adopt cloud native architecture is that things can fail, and the whole system should work. It should, you have redundancy, you have auto scale, like all of these properties are there, which makes it harder from the observability side, because you can imagine you want to tell them when something like that happens so they fix it eventually, but like some of those are not the same urgency as other issues there. So there's a lot of work I think to be done, and we're spending a lot of time in this space of like trying to really cut through the noise there a little bit as well. So, those are probably the two big focus areas for us as a company moving forward.
I think any incremental time you can save off of unnecessary on-call will
Yes.
earn you huge karma points and
Yes.
forever.
Yes.
Um,
That is the dream. As somebody who was on call until pretty recently, that is the dream for sure. So yeah.
Absolutely. I have so many more questions, but we're getting close to the end of the show, and
Yeah.
I generally end with a set of closing questions, which
Okay. Yeah.
first is, what would your advice be for founders trying to do a startup today? Or if you think of yourself when you first started, what do you wish you had known that you know now?
I I wish I knew a lot of things. Um, I I would say that's a hard question to answer because I think it depends on why you are trying to do a startup, and I think there are many different reasons and motivations. I think if I think back to my early days, it was really just I wanted to build tech, and that's a very, I think, valid reason to start a company. Whereas more recently at Chronosphere, we want to build like a real sizable business and company here, right? So I think it depends on the reason. I think ensuring that you have the right perhaps strategy or approach to the problem based on your motivations is probably important. There, I think one of the things I do say is like, look, I like before this, I was leading a team of engineers. There's nothing like I've never been a founder before. Like it doesn't like anybody could do this. I would say if you're rightly motivated and you have the right type of problem you want to solve, you can do this. So like I think the advice there is like go for it. There's nothing special about these founders or CEOs that are no different from anyone else. I think that there's a element of luck, but I think anyone can come and do this. And then finally, I would say, as you get started, this is what I found was that you almost find this community of other founders that I think, even though they're so busy, they understand what it means to be a founder and how hard it is. So I've always found that community of founders to be very open and willing to help. And my advice to new startup founders is try to leverage that as much as possible. We don't have a lot of time, but if any extra time I do have, I generally like to give it to founders more than anything else. So it's probably my other piece of advice there.
Absolutely. I agree. My next question, when you think of success, does someone or something come to mind?
I think when I think of success, I probably think of it in two angles. One is like the type of leader or the successful type of leader that I look up to, and I think I have a particular profile in mind that I love, where there are these founders that I think are successful, but they almost like don't have an ego about it, and they understand that there's a lot of survivor bias, and that what works for one person may not work for the next person or the next company. There is a set of leaders out there that are just they're great and they're so humble about it, and they understand 100% that look, luck had a huge component to play with in their success. And I give those founders, I would say, a lot more respect than the ones that are out there spouting that the way that they did it was the only way, and they stumbled upon like a secret formula. I just don't think that exists there. So from like a founder company leader perspective, that's one profile of people I respect and admire a lot. And then from a company perspective, there are companies out there that I think when you hire somebody from that company, they look back and talk about their experience at that company with a certain sense of pride and joy. And not all companies have this. In fact, very few companies, their alums can look at it that way. But when you come across a company like that, I think, and to give you a specific one, like MuleSoft is a company where I know the culture was great. And I know nothing about the founders there or anything like that, but it's like that's the type of company you strive to build. One that I think leaves can create this community of like shared experience, and even when people move on from that company, they still look back at that time with such pride, I think is generally, at least as a founder, like what you're striving for your company to get to, I would say. So, when I think about success, I think about it from those two vectors there.
Yeah, I think it's always, I think anywhere people go, like you want to do your best work, you want to do work that you're proud of, and
Yeah.
any place that enables that is great.
Yeah.
My last question, it's an ask or offer. Do you have any asks of my audience or any offers that you would like to make?
I mean, as a growing tech company, I think my ask would be, if folks know anyone who's looking to join a startup like this, whether on the go-to-market side and try to sell to the largest enterprises, or market to the largest enterprises, or on the technical side, trying to work on large distributed systems problems. Of course, always looking to be introduced to good talent. I think that would be my ask if people have that in their networks. I don't necessarily have a offer per se, but I would say, if your audience is dealing with a observability cost problem, or perhaps an observability effectiveness problem, would love to chat with them about that. I would say more than anything else. I don't necessarily have like a coupon code or anything like that, but if observability is a pain at your for you, then I'd love to chat to them.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of the show. Martin, thank you so much for coming on, and this was great talking.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Kevin. Great conversation. And hope to do it again sometime soon.
Hey, just one more thing before you go. Thanks for listening to this episode of Founders Table. If you like the show, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also consider giving us a rating, as it helps others find the podcast. You can find all episodes as well as more information about the show at founderstable.co. Until next time, stay hungry.